The air in the apartment was thick with the scent of burnt toast and Mateo's cheap cologne when the doorbell chimed, sharp and unyielding, like a warning shot. Ezra froze, his paintbrush hovering over the half-finished canvas, the vibrant reds and blues bleeding into a storm of uncertainty. He wasn't ready for this. Mateo's dad, a man he'd never met, was about to walk through that door, and something in Ezra's gut screamed this visit would unravel everything. Ezra had always been the quiet one, the kid who hid behind sketchbooks and late-night playlists, content to let Mateo, his roommate of 2 years, fill the silence with his infectious laughter and endless stories. Their third-floor apartment in this sleepy upstate New York college town was a sanctuary of chaos. Pizza boxes stacked like modern art, fairy lights strung haphazardly over thrift store furniture, and Mateo's guitar riffs echoing at 2 a.m. They were opposites, Ezra and Mateo, but it worked. Mateo was the sun, all warmth and reckless charm, while Ezra was the shadow, observing, feeling too much, saying too little. Their friendship was easy, unforced, but lately, Ezra's heart had started tripping over itself whenever Mateo lingered too close, his teasing grin sparking something Ezra wasn't ready to name. "Yo, Easy, you gonna get that or what?" Mateo called from the kitchen, where he was wrestling with a jar of salsa. His dark curls bounced as he turned, his brown eyes glinting with that playful edge that always made Ezra's chest tighten. Ezra set down his brush, wiping his paint-streaked hands on his jeans. "Your dad, your problem," he shot back, but his voice wavered. He didn't know why the idea of meeting Richard Navarro made his palms sweat. Mateo had mentioned him in passing, a retired military man turned corporate consultant, stern but fair, who raised Mateo alone after his mom left when he was 5. The stories painted Richard as a distant figure, more myth than man, but they carried a warmth that made Ezra curious and uneasy. The doorbell rang again, insistent. Mateo cursed under his breath and jogged to the door, flinging it open. "Dad, you made it." His voice was all enthusiasm, but Ezra caught the slight strain in it, like he was performing for an audience of one. Richard Navarro stepped inside, and the room seemed to shrink. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair cropped close and a jawline that could cut glass. His tailored coat and polished boots screamed money, but it was his eyes, piercing blue, sharp as a blade, that pinned Ezra in place. They swept over the cluttered apartment, lingering on Ezra for a fraction too long, and in that moment, Ezra felt exposed, like Richard could see every secret he'd ever buried. "Good to see you, kid," Richard said to Mateo, his voice low and gravelly, pulling his son into a brief, firm hug. But his gaze flicked back to Ezra, unreadable yet heavy, like a storm cloud promising rain. This must be the artist. Ezra's throat tightened. "Ezra, nice to meet you, Mr. Navarro." He extended a hand, hoping it wasn't trembling. Richard's grip was strong, his palm calloused, and the contact sent a jolt through Ezra's arm, like touching a live wire. "Call me Richard," he said, his tone neutral but his eyes still locked on Ezra's, searching. For what? Ezra couldn't guess, but it felt like more than a casual introduction. Mateo, oblivious, clapped his hands together. "All right, Dad, you're crashing on the couch tonight. Ezra's got the spare room, but it's basically a storage closet, so don't get any ideas." He grinned, tossing a bag of chips onto the counter. "You hungry? We've got, salsa and questionable leftovers." Richard's lips twitched, almost a smile. "I'll manage." He set his duffel bag down, his movements deliberate, like he was staking a claim. "You boys been keeping out of trouble?" "Mostly," Mateo said, winking at Ezra. "Easy keeps me grounded. Right, man?" Ezra forced a laugh, but his skin prickled under Richard's gaze. There was something about the man, something that felt like it could upend the fragile balance of their little world. He turned back to his canvas, pretending to focus, but his mind was racing. Why did Richard look at him like that? like he knew something Ezra didn't. As the evening unfolded, the apartment filled with Mateo's chatter, stories about his music theory classes, the open mic night he bombed last week, and the time he and Ezra got stuck in a snowbank trying to borrow a campus golf cart. Richard listened, nodding, but his attention kept drifting to Ezra, subtle but unmistakable. Each glance was a spark, igniting a mix of fear and curiosity in Ezra's chest. He tried to shake it off, blaming his overactive imagination, but the feeling clung to him like damp clothes. Dinner was a mismatched affair. Takeout pizza, mismatched plates, and Mateo's playlist blaring indie rock. Ezra sat across from Richard, hyper-aware of every movement. The way Richard's fingers curled around his glass, the way his eyes softened when Mateo laughed, but sharpened when they met Ezra's. It wasn't hostile, but it was something. Something that made Ezra's pulse race and his thoughts spiral. "So, Ezra," Richard said suddenly, his voice cutting through Mateo's story about a rogue raccoon in the dumpster. "Mateo says you're studying art. What's your focus?" Ezra swallowed, caught off guard. Painting mostly. Figurative stuff. I'm trying to capture emotions, I guess. The messy ones." Richard leaned forward, elbows on the table, his gaze pinning Ezra like a butterfly to a board. "Messy emotions," he repeated, almost to himself. "That's brave. Most people run from those." The words landed like a stone in Ezra's chest. He wanted to look away, but Richard's eyes held him, steady and unrelenting, like he was peeling back layers Ezra didn't even know he had. Mateo, oblivious, shoved another slice of pizza in his mouth and launched into a rant about his professor's grading curve. But Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that Richard's visit wasn't just about catching up with his son. That look, the one that lingered too long, that carried a weight Ezra couldn't decipher. It promised something more, something dangerous, something that could change everything. As night fell, the apartment quieted, and Mateo sprawled on the couch, scrolling through his phone. Richard stood by the balcony door, staring out at the twinkling campus lights, his silhouette stark against the glass. Ezra watched him from the kitchen, his heart pounding for reasons he couldn't name. "Get some sleep, boys," Richard said without turning, his voice low, almost intimate. "We've got a big day tomorrow." Ezra's breath caught. Tomorrow. Why did that word feel like a threat? The morning sun sliced through the apartment's crooked blinds, painting stripes across Ezra's canvas, where the colors from last night had dried into a chaotic swirl. He hadn't slept, not really. Richard's gaze had haunted him, flickering in and out of restless dreams like a warning he couldn't decode. By the time he stumbled into the kitchen, Mateo was already up, blasting reggaeton and flipping pancakes with questionable precision. "Morning, sunshine," Mateo called, tossing a burnt pancake onto a plate. "You look like you fought a ghost and lost." Ezra managed a half-smile, rubbing his eyes. "Just didn't sleep great." He glanced toward the living room, where Richard's duffel bag sat neatly by the couch, but the man himself was nowhere in sight. "Dad's out for a run," Mateo said, reading Ezra's mind. "Guy's like a machine. 45, and still does 5 miles before breakfast." He shook his head, grinning. "You should have seen him when I was a kid. Used to make me do push-ups before school." Ezra nodded, pouring coffee to steady his nerves. He wanted to ask about Richard, about that look, about why it felt like the man was studying him, but the words stuck in his throat. Instead, he sipped the bitter brew and watched Mateo dance around the kitchen, oblivious to the storm brewing in Ezra's head. Richard returned 20 minutes later, his gray t-shirt damp with sweat, his breathing steady despite the flush in his cheeks. He moved with a quiet power, like a predator who knew he didn't need to roar to be heard. "Morning, Ezra," he said, his voice calm but carrying that same undercurrent of intensity. His eyes locked onto Ezra's again, just for a moment, and it was enough to make Ezra's coffee mug tremble in his hands. "Morning," Ezra mumbled, turning to rinse his mug, desperate for an excuse to break eye contact. But he could feel Richard watching him, the weight of it pressing against his spine. The day unfolded with a strange rhythm. Mateo had planned a loose itinerary for his dad's visit. A campus tour, lunch at the local diner, maybe a hike if the weather held. Ezra tagged along, partly because Mateo begged him to, partly because he couldn't shake his curiosity about Richard. Every interaction with the man felt like a chess move, calculated and deliberate, yet cloaked in casual charm. At the campus art gallery, Ezra lingered by his own painting, a raw, abstract piece about grief, all jagged lines and muted grace. Mateo was busy charming a group of freshmen, leaving Ezra alone with Richard, who stood silently beside him, studying the canvas. "This yours?" Richard asked, his voice low, almost reverent. Ezra nodded, his throat tight. "Yeah, from last semester. It's personal." Richard tilted his head, his eyes tracing the violent strokes. "It's powerful, like you're screaming without making a sound." He turned to Ezra, his gaze softening, but no less piercing. "You've got a lot to say, don't you?" Ezra's breath hitched. No one had ever described his work like that, like they saw him, not just the paint. "I guess," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sometimes it's the only way I know how to let it out." Richard nodded, like he understood something Ezra hadn't said. "Keep saying it. The world needs more voices like yours." His hand brushed Ezra's shoulder, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver down Ezra's spine. It was innocent enough, but it lingered in Ezra's mind, a spark in a forest of dry leaves. Lunch at the diner was louder, messier, with Mateo recounting embarrassing childhood stories while Richard listened with a rare, genuine smile. But even then, Ezra caught those glances, quick, subtle, but loaded with something unspoken. It wasn't attraction, not exactly, but it was something. A recognition, maybe. A challenge. Ezra couldn't tell if he was imagining it, or if Richard was deliberately pulling him into some invisible game. By the time they reached the hiking trail, Ezra's nerves were frayed. The autumn woods were alive with color. Crimson leaves crunching underfoot, the air crisp and sharp. Mateo led the way, joking about bears and bad horror movies, while Richard walked beside Ezra, his silence louder than Mateo's chatter. "You're quiet today," Richard said after a while, his tone casual, but his eyes sharp. "Something on your mind?" Ezra's heart skipped. He wanted to brush it off, to say he was just tired, but Richard's gaze demanded honesty. "Just adjusting," he said finally. "You're not what I expected." Richard raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "And what did you expect?" "I don't know," Ezra admitted, his voice raw. "Someone colder, maybe. Mateo's stories made you sound like a drill sergeant." Richard chuckled, a low, warm sound that caught Ezra off guard. "I was once. But life has a way of softening the edges." He paused, his eyes locking onto Ezra's again, or sharpening the ones that matter. Ezra's stomach twisted. There it was again, that intensity, that unspoken promise of something more. He wanted to ask what Richard meant, to demand answers, but Mateo's shout from up the trail broke the moment. "Yo, you slowpokes. There's a view up here you gotta see." Richard's smile faded, but his eyes lingered on Ezra for a beat longer before he turned to follow his son. Ezra stood rooted to the spot, his heart pounding, the forest around him suddenly too quiet, too still. That night, back at the apartment, Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting. Richard was only staying a few days, but each moment with him felt like a step toward an edge Ezra couldn't see. As he lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, he heard the floorboards creak outside his door. His breath caught, imagining Richard standing there, that piercing gaze cutting through the dark. But no one knocked. The apartment stayed silent, and Ezra was left wondering if he was reading too much into those looks, or if Richard Navarro was about to turn his world upside down. The next morning brought a restless energy to the apartment, like the air itself was holding its breath. Ezra woke to the sound of Mateo strumming his guitar, the chords soft but off-key, mirroring the unease twisting in Ezra's gut. He couldn't stop replaying Richard's words from the hike, sharpening the ones that matter, and the way his touch had lingered, brief but electric. Breakfast was quieter than the day before. Mateo, nursing a hangover from sneaking beers with friends after the hike, slumped over his coffee, muttering about a group project. Richard, meanwhile, was pristine, showered, shaved, his button-down crisp as if he hadn't slept on a lumpy couch. He moved through the kitchen with a quiet efficiency, brewing a fresh pot of coffee, his eyes flicking to Ezra every few moments. "You're up early," Richard said, handing Ezra a mug. His fingers brushed Ezra's, deliberate or not, and the warmth of the ceramic did nothing to calm the spark that shot through Ezra's veins. "Thanks," Ezra mumbled, ducking his head. He focused on the coffee, black and bitter, trying to ignore the way Richard's presence filled the room, like a melody you couldn't unhear. Mateo groaned, oblivious. "Dad, you're too functional for this hour. Easy, tell him to chill." Ezra forced a laugh, but it came out strained. "He's your dad. You tell him." Richard's lips quirked, but his eyes stayed on Ezra, steady and unyielding. "I like to keep busy," he said, his voice low. "Keeps the mind sharp." There it was again, that intensity, like a current pulling Ezra under. He wanted to ask what Richard meant, to confront the weight behind those glances, but Mateo's presence anchored him to silence. Instead, he sipped his coffee and let the moment pass, though it left a hollow ache in his chest. The day's plan was simple: a trip to the local farmer's market, a nod to Mateo's attempt to show Dad the town's charm. The market was a riot of color and noise, vendors hawking apples, homemade jams, and knitted scarves under a crisp autumn sky. Ezra trailed behind Mateo and Richard, his sketchbook tucked under his arm, half hoping to blend into the crowd. But Richard kept drawing him back, asking questions about his art, his childhood in a small Ohio town, his dreams beyond college. Each question felt like a thread, weaving Ezra into something bigger, something he wasn't sure he was ready for. "You ever think about showing your work?" Richard asked as they paused by a stall selling pottery. His tone was casual, but his eyes were anything but. "Galleries, I mean. Somewhere bigger than this town." Ezra shrugged, his fingers tightening around his sketchbook. "I don't know. It's personal. I'm not sure I'm ready for people to pick it apart." Richard nodded, his gaze softening. "Fair enough. But talent like yours, it's meant to be seen. Don't hide it forever." The words hit Ezra harder than they should have. He wasn't used to people believing in him, not like that. His parents had called his art a hobby. His professors praised his technique, but not his soul. Richard's faith, quiet but unshakable, felt like a lifeline and a weight. Mateo, meanwhile, was haggling over a jar of honey, his laughter cutting through the market's hum. Ezra watched him, the familiar ache blooming in his chest. He'd spent months dodging his feelings for Mateo, convincing himself they were just roommates, just friends. But Richard's presence was stirring something else, something deeper, like a fault line shifting beneath the surface. As the day wore on, the tension grew. At a coffee shop later, Richard sat across from Ezra, his knee brushing Ezra's under the table. It was accidental. At least, Ezra told himself it was. But the contact sent a jolt through him, sharp and undeniable. Richard didn't move away, and neither did Ezra, though his heart hammered so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. Mateo, scrolling through his phone, didn't notice. But when Richard leaned forward, his voice low, and said, "You're holding back, Ezra." "What?" The words felt like a confession and a challenge all at once. Ezra's mouth went dry. "I'm not," he lied, but his voice cracked, betraying him. Richard's eyes narrowed, not unkindly, but with a knowing that made Ezra feel bare. "You are," he said simply, "and I think you know why." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Mateo dragged them to a local bookstore, then a dive bar where he flirted with the bartender while Richard and Ezra sat in a corner booth, the air between them thick with unspoken words. Ezra tried to focus on Mateo's stories, on the neon lights flickering above the bar, but Richard's presence was a magnet, pulling his thoughts into dangerous territory. That night, as Mateo crashed early, exhausted from the day, Ezra found himself alone with Richard in the living room. The apartment was quiet, save for the hum of the fridge and the distant sound of campus traffic. Richard sat on the couch, a glass of whiskey in hand, his eyes fixed on Ezra with that same unrelenting intensity. "You're not like most kids your age," Richard said, breaking the silence. "You see things, feel things. Most people don't." Ezra's heart raced. He wanted to deflect, to make a joke, but Richard's gaze held him fast. "I don't know what you mean," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Richard leaned forward, his elbows on his knees, the whiskey glass dangling between his fingers. "I think you do," he said softly, "and I think it scares you." Ezra's breath caught. He wanted to run, to hide, but something in Richard's voice, something raw and real, kept him rooted to the spot. For the first time, he let himself wonder, what did Richard see in him? And why did it feel like the answer could unravel everything? The apartment felt smaller with every passing hour, as if Richard's presence was a tide, rising to swallow the space Ezra had once called safe. He woke to the sound of rain tapping against the windows, a steady rhythm that matched the unease pulsing in his veins. Today was Richard's last full day, and the thought filled Ezra with a strange mix of relief and dread. Mateo, oblivious as ever, was in high spirits, planning a farewell dinner at a local Italian restaurant. "Gotta send Dad off in style," he said, tossing a soccer ball between his hands. "You in easy? They've got this tiramisu that'll make you cry." Ezra nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, sounds good." But his eyes drifted to Richard, who was reading a newspaper at the kitchen table, his glasses perched on his nose, looking every bit the composed patriarch. Yet when he glanced up, catching Ezra's gaze, there was that spark again, sharp, searching, like he was waiting for Ezra to make a move. The day unfolded in fragments. A lazy morning of Mateo strumming his guitar while Richard shared stories of his military days, each one laced with a quiet pride that made Mateo beam. Ezra listened, sketching absently in his notebook, but his pencil faltered every time Richard's eyes met his. It wasn't just the looks now. It was the way Richard seemed to know him, to see the parts of Ezra he kept locked away, the fear, the longing, the confusion he hadn't dared name. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, leaving the campus slick and shimmering. Mateo suggested a walk to the lake, a spot where students often gathered to skip stones or sneak beers. Ezra trailed behind, his hands stuffed in his jacket pockets, watching Richard and Mateo walk side by side. They looked so alike, same broad shoulders, same easy stride. But where Mateo was all light and laughter, Richard carried a gravity that drew Ezra in, like a planet orbiting too close to a star. At the lake, Mateo challenged Richard to a stone-skipping contest, their laughter echoing across the water. Ezra sat on a fallen log, sketching the scene, his pencil capturing the curve of Richard's arm as he threw a stone, the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled. But when Richard turned, catching Ezra mid-sketch, his expression shifted, less guarded, more vulnerable, like he'd been caught too. "You're good," Richard said, walking over and nodding at the sketchbook. "Mind if I see?" Ezra hesitated, his heart pounding, but he handed over the book. Richard flipped through the pages, his fingers careful, almost reverent. He paused on a sketch of Mateo laughing, then another of the apartment at dusk, all shadows and warm light. Finally, he stopped at the half-finished sketch of himself, his eyes tracing the lines Ezra had drawn. "This how you see me?" Richard asked, his voice low, almost a whisper. Ezra swallowed, his mouth dry. "It's just a sketch." Richard handed the book back, his fingers brushing Ezra's again, and this time, Ezra was sure it wasn't accidental. "It's more than that," Richard said. "You see what most people miss. The words hung between them, heavy and fragile, like glass about to shatter. Ezra wanted to ask what he meant, to demand clarity, but Mateo's shout broke the moment, calling them back for another round of stone skipping. Dinner at the restaurant was a blur of candlelight and clinking glasses. Mateo dominated the conversation, recounting their college adventures, while Ezra picked at his pasta, hyper-aware of Richard sitting across from him. Every glance, every brush of their knees under the table, felt like a secret only they shared. It was thrilling and terrifying, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing one step could send you plummeting. Later, back at the apartment, Mateo passed out on the couch, a glass of wine still in his hand. The rain had started again, a soft patter against the windows, and Ezra found himself alone with Richard once more. They sat in the kitchen, the dim light casting shadows across Richard's face, making him look both older and younger, like a man carrying too many stories. "You're leaving tomorrow," Ezra said, breaking the silence. His voice was steadier than he felt. Richard nodded, his eyes never leaving Ezra's. "I am, but I'll be back. Mateo's got a gig next month, and I promised I'd come." Ezra's heart sank and soared at the same time. "That's good," he said, but the words felt hollow. He wanted to say more, to ask why Richard looked at him like that, why every word felt like a step toward something dangerous. But fear kept him silent. Richard leaned forward, his voice low. "Ezra, you don't have to hide. Not from me." The words hit like a punch, stealing Ezra's breath. He opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. Richard's gaze was unrelenting, not cruel but piercing, like he could see every crack in Ezra's armor. "I'm not hiding," Ezra said finally, but it was a lie, and they both knew it. Richard's lips curved, a sad, knowing smile. "You will, when you're ready." He stood, his chair scraping softly against the floor, and for a moment, Ezra thought he might reach out, might bridge the gap between them. But Richard only nodded and walked to the balcony, leaving Ezra alone with the rain and the weight of words unspoken. Richard's departure the next morning was quiet, almost anticlimactic. He hugged Mateo tightly, his hand lingering on his son's shoulder, and offered Ezra a handshake that felt too formal after the intensity of the past few days. But his eyes, those piercing blue eyes, held Ezra's for a moment too long, promising something Ezra couldn't yet grasp. "Take care of him," Richard said, nodding toward Mateo, who was already distracted, scrolling through his phone. But the words felt like they were meant for Ezra alone, a charge he wasn't sure he could carry. And then Richard was gone, his car disappearing down the street, leaving Ezra with a hollow ache he couldn't name. The apartment felt too big without him, the silence too loud. Mateo, oblivious, cranked up his music and started planning a party for the weekend, but Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something irreversible. The weeks that followed were a blur of classes, late-night painting sessions, and Mateo's relentless energy. But Ezra was distracted, his thoughts circling back to Richard, his voice, his touch, the way he'd seen Ezra in a way no one else had. He tried to focus on his art, pouring his confusion into jagged lines and bold colors, but every stroke felt like a question he couldn't answer. Mateo noticed, of course. "You okay, man?" he asked one night, sprawled on the couch with a beer. "You've been, I don't know, weird since Dad left." Ezra froze, his paintbrush hovering over the canvas. "Just stressed," he lied. "Midterms, you know." Mateo raised an eyebrow, but didn't push. "All right, but if you need to talk, I'm here. You're my guy, EZ." The words warmed Ezra's heart, but they also stung. Mateo was his guy, too, his best friend, his anchor, but the feelings Ezra had been dodging for months were growing louder, harder to ignore. And now, layered over them, was the memory of Richard's gaze, the weight of his words, the unspoken promise that lingered like a ghost. When Richard texted Mateo to confirm he'd be back for the open mic night, Ezra's heart lurched. He wasn't sure if he was excited or terrified, but the thought of seeing Richard again sent a thrill through him, sharp and dangerous. He spent the days leading up to the event in a haze, his sketchbook filling with half-finished drawings of Richard's face, Mateo's smile, the apartment at dusk. The night of the open mic arrived, the campus bar packed with students and locals, the air thick with cigarette smoke and nervous energy. Mateo was a ball of nerves, tuning his guitar backstage, while Ezra sat at a table near the front, his sketchbook open but untouched. Richard arrived late, slipping into the seat beside Ezra just as the first act started. His presence was a jolt, like a match struck in the dark. "Good to see you," Richard said, his voice low, his eyes locking onto Ezra's with that familiar intensity. "Missed this place." Ezra's throat tightened. "Yeah," he managed. "It's home." Richard nodded, but his gaze lingered, searching. "You've been thinking about what I said." It wasn't a question. Ezra's heart pounded, his fingers gripping the edge of his sketchbook. "Maybe," he admitted, his voice barely audible over the music. Richard leaned closer, his breath warm against Ezra's ear. "Don't run from it, Ezra. Whatever it is, it's part of you." The words sent a shiver down Ezra's spine, but before he could respond, Mateo took the stage, his guitar slung low, his grin lighting up the room. The crowd cheered, and Ezra clapped along, but his mind was elsewhere, tangled in Richard's words, in the heat of his presence. Mateo's performance was electric, his voice raw and soulful, weaving stories of love and loss that hit Ezra harder than he expected. He glanced at Richard, who was watching his son with a pride that softened his sharp edges, but when their eyes met, that intensity was back, pulling Ezra under. After the set, Mateo joined them, flushed and grinning, oblivious to the undercurrent between Ezra and his father. They stayed late, drinking and laughing, but Ezra couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing on a fault line, waiting for it to crack. As they walked back to the apartment, Richard fell into step beside Ezra, his shoulder brushing against his. "You're braver than you think," he said quietly, so Mateo wouldn't hear. "Don't let fear win." Ezra's breath caught. He wanted to ask what Richard meant, to demand answers, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he nodded, his heart racing, and followed Richard and Mateo into the night, knowing that whatever came next would change everything. The open mic night left a lingering hum in Ezra's chest, like a song he couldn't stop hearing. Mateo was still riding the high of his performance, reenacting the crowd's cheers as they sprawled in the apartment, but Ezra's mind was elsewhere, caught in the orbit of Richard's words. "Don't let fear win." They echoed through him, stirring something he'd spent years burying. Richard was quieter this visit, his intensity tempered by a warmth that caught Ezra off guard. He helped with breakfast, flipping pancakes with a precision Mateo lacked, and joined them for a lazy day exploring the town's record shops and coffee haunts. But every moment carried a charge, every glance a question. Ezra felt it in the way Richard's hand lingered when passing him a coffee, in the way his voice softened when he said Ezra's name. That evening, as Mateo practiced new chords in his room, Ezra and Richard ended up alone on the balcony, the autumn air sharp and cool. The campus lights twinkled below, a constellation of lives unaware of the storm brewing in Ezra's heart. Richard leaned against the railing, his profile sharp against the dusk, and Ezra felt the weight of the moment, like the world was holding its breath. "You're still holding back," Richard said, his voice low, not accusing but certain. "Why?" Ezra's heart pounded. He gripped the railing, the metal cold against his palms. "I don't know what you want from me," he said finally, his voice raw. "You keep looking at me, saying things, like you see something I don't." Richard turned, his eyes locking onto Ezra's, and for the first time, there was no mask, no guarded edge. Just honesty, raw and unguarded. "I see you, Ezra. The real you. The one you're afraid to let out." Ezra's breath hitched. He wanted to deny it, to laugh it off, but Richard's gaze held him fast, stripping away his defenses. "What if I don't know who that is?" he whispered. Richard stepped closer, close enough that Ezra could feel the heat of him, the steady rhythm of his breathing. "Then let me help you find out," he said softly. "No pressure, no expectations, just truth." The words were a lifeline, and Ezra wanted to grab it, but fear clawed at him. He thought of Mateo, of the feelings he'd buried, of the confusion Richard's presence had stirred. "What about Mateo?" he asked, his voice breaking. "He's your son, my best friend." Richard's expression softened, a flicker of pain crossing his face. "Mateo's my world," he said. "But this isn't about him. It's about you. And me." Ezra's heart stopped. The air between them crackled, heavy with possibility. He wanted to lean in, to cross the line, but the weight of it, the risk, the unknown, held him back. "I can't," he said, his voice barely audible. "Not yet." Richard nodded, his eyes never leaving Ezra's. "I know," he said, "but when you're ready, I'll be here." The rest of the night passed in a haze. Mateo rejoined them, oblivious, and they watched a movie. The three of them sprawled on the couch like nothing had changed. But everything had. Ezra could feel it in the way Richard's presence filled the room, in the way his own heart raced every time their eyes met. The next morning, Richard left again, his goodbye brief but heavy. He hugged Mateo, then turned to Ezra, his handshake lingering, his eyes saying what words couldn't. "See you soon," he said, and Ezra felt the promise in it, the weight of a future he wasn't sure he could face. In the weeks that followed, Ezra threw himself into his art, painting with a fury he didn't know he had. His canvases were raw, chaotic, filled with the storm of his feelings, for Mateo, for Richard, for the parts of himself he'd kept hidden. He didn't know what he wanted, but he knew he couldn't keep running. When Richard texted Mateo about another visit, Ezra's heart leapt. He wasn't ready, not yet, but he was closer than he'd ever been. And as he stood in the apartment, staring at his latest painting, a collision of blues and reds, of fear and desire, he knew one thing for certain. Richard Navarro had seen him, truly seen him, and there was no going back. Winter crept into the college town, dusting the campus with snow and turning the apartment into a cocoon of warmth and fairy lights. Ezra's paintings lined the walls now, each one a step toward the truth Richard had urged him to find. Mateo, ever the optimist, declared it the coziest vibe ever, but Ezra felt the weight of the coming days, knowing Richard's next visit was imminent. When Richard arrived, the air shifted again, charged with the unspoken. Mateo greeted him with his usual enthusiasm, but Ezra saw the subtle strain in Richard's smile, the way his eyes sought Ezra's first. The visit was shorter this time, a weekend for Mateo's winter recital, but every moment felt like a countdown. On the second night, after Mateo's performance, the three of them ended up at the same dive bar, the one where neon lights flickered and the jukebox played old rock ballads. Mateo was in his element, charming the crowd, while Ezra and Richard sat in their corner booth, the space between them alive with tension. "You've changed," Richard said, his voice cutting through the bar's hum. "Your art. It's bolder now." Ezra nodded, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass. "I'm trying," he said. "To be honest." Richard's eyes softened, but the intensity remained. "It suits you," he said. "Honesty always does." Ezra's heart raced. He thought of the months since Richard's first visit, the way his feelings had unraveled, his unspoken love for Mateo, his confusion about Richard, the fear of what it all meant. He'd spent so long hiding, afraid of his own heart, but Richard's presence had cracked that shell, letting light in. "I'm scared," Ezra admitted, his voice barely audible. "Of what I feel. For Mateo. For you." Richard's breath caught, a flicker of surprise crossing his face. But he didn't pull away. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand covering Ezra's, warm and steady. "Fear's part of it," he said. "But so is courage. You've got that, Ezra. More than you know." The touch was electric, grounding Ezra and setting him ablaze all at once. He wanted to pull away, to run, but he didn't. For the first time, He let himself feel it. The pull toward Richard, the love for Matteo, the truth of who he was. Matteo returned, breaking the moment, but the air had changed. Ezra felt lighter, like he'd shed a weight he hadn't known he was carrying. The rest of the night was a blur of laughter and music, but Ezra carried Richard's words with him, a beacon in the dark. The next morning, as Richard prepared to leave, Ezra found him on the balcony, staring at the snow-covered campus. "I meant what I said," Richard told him, his voice low. "You're brave, Ezra, and you're not alone." Ezra nodded, his throat tight. "I know," he said, "and thank you for seeing me." Richard's smile was small but real, and when he hugged Ezra goodbye, it felt like a promise kept. As his car pulled away, Ezra stood in the snow, his breath clouding the air, and felt something shift inside him, a clarity, a courage, a truth he was finally ready to claim. Back in the apartment, Matteo was strumming his guitar, his grin as bright as ever. "You good, Easy?" he asked, glancing up. Ezra smiled, a real smile, and nodded. "Yeah," he said, "I'm getting there." And as he picked up his paintbrush, the canvas before him blank and full of possibility, Ezra knew he was ready to paint his truth, messy, beautiful, and wholly his own. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to take the next step.